I just want to note that what I'll be talking about is more like a case study than what the previous speakers have talked about, and it's been a challenge for data collection. That's been our biggest issue on this study. I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Ann Jekyll, who's at UNM now, and Secretary David Martin, who's the Secretary of Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources in New Mexico. And he is the one who has really been pushing looking at alternative resources of water, including produced water and brackish water in the state, to help supplement fresh water. So a quick profile for New Mexico. We're not a very large state in terms of population. We are fairly large in terms of area. We're in the southwestern part of the U.S., west of Texas, east of Arizona, north of Mexico. We have a high desert climate, sometimes fairly high elevation, up to places with over 10,000 feet elevation, but we have very low precipitation ranges, not a lot of population, about 2 million people. Let's see, we have very limited surface water availability, and we have very widespread groundwater availability. However, it is under stress in many places. We are a fully allocated state when it comes to water. That means that all of the water in the state, or almost all of it, has been allocated in terms of water rights. So somebody owns every bit of the water in the state, and if someone needs water, they're going to have to work with others and with the state engineer to try and build up their water resources, either by purchase or lease. We have 16 different water planning regions, and that is a reflection of our very complex geology. A lot of basins in the state contain our groundwater. We have learned to do a good job of conserving water in many sectors, and we continue to make progress in this area. This is a diagram from our power production since 2002, excuse me. However, developing the use of alternative water resources, such as produced water and brackish groundwater, is a very important aspect of conserving our valuable fresh water. This shows where New Mexico is. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but we're here west of Texas. This is an image taken by the US, or drawn by the USDA that shows drought designation at the very peak of the drought in 2014. About a third of the US was impacted. Since then, drought has ceased in New Mexico as a result of El Nino patterns, also in Arizona, Oklahoma, and Texas mostly. California still has some regions where they have not caught up despite heavy rains and snow. So it's gotten a little better. This also shows our Palmer Drought Severity Index between 1900 and 2013. The wet years are shown in green above the baseline. Dry years are shown in yellow below the baseline. What is striking to me is the trend from the 90s, which were a very wet period, through now. This doesn't go all the way to 2015, which actually is in the green this year. 2015 and a little bit of 2016 were in the green. But our trend has been a drying trend, and we've seen more and more subsequent years of dry, next to dry, not followed by wet years, and increasing impact of dryness in those years. So we definitely have a water issue here. And we also had many years of very strong energy development in the southeast region of the state. We had a good participation in the oil and gas boom that happened from about 2005 on. It has, of course, slowed down most recently, but we had quite a busy few years with hydraulic fracturing driving the boom in oil and gas development. This is in the Permian Basin, which is in southeastern New Mexico. There's 3 counties that connect to the Permian Basin, Chavez, Eddy, and Lee counties, and so I'll talk about those 3 counties. As the hydraulic fracturing boom grew, there was a lot of water use by the oil and gas industry. We believe that it rose dramatically, their water use rose dramatically because of the use of hydraulic fracturing. However, it's very hard to quantify this. We also noted at the same time that drought year incidence and severity increased. There was a great deal of surface water supply stress, increased groundwater use, and reduced groundwater recharge. So we had a number of questions that we came up with. First, we wanted to know how large were the freshwater withdrawals by the oil and gas industry during this time. How did they compare with other types of withdrawals, for example, municipal or agricultural, and how impactful were those withdrawals? Could we reuse produced water, and would that reduce impacts and be economically feasible for the companies? and then what policy changes would be needed to improve outcomes by reusing this produced water. So we had a number of questions, and they seem fairly simple, but it turned out not to be that simple of a series of questions. The data that is gathered for oil and gas production does not mesh well with data that is gathered to reflect freshwater use. Intervals of freshwater data use collection are every 5 years. Oil and gas data is collected more frequently, and agricultural data is collected every 5 years, but in different year intervals. So if you collect water information in 2000 for freshwater use, you might collect it in 2002 for agricultural use. So everything's sort of offset. Metering of freshwater withdrawals and attribution of water sales is not always known. It depends on the basin in terms of metering, and water sales is not always recorded. And so the actual end user of freshwater is not known. So we don't really have a good way of recognizing the positive impacts that reuse of produced water would have, but we also can't easily quantify the negative impacts, but we did make a shot at it and tried. This shows the oil and gas basins, and you can see the Permian Basin, Chavez, Eddy, and Lee counties down here in the southeast. This is the area that we are looking at. This is mostly a gas-producing basin, although there also is oil. It has both old and new, both conventional and unconventional production in this area. I also wanted to quickly show this example of 2 different water wells. These are relatively shallow wells for water supply in the region. One's in Eddy and one is in Lee County. Both of these water wells show severe drops in the water levels in these wells over the last several years. It's not quite as easy to see on the right-hand side, but you can see that there has been a severe drop. And this is what we expected would impact the withdrawals that agricultural users would experience. We expected that drought would reduce the amount of fresh groundwater that was available. It would reduce the amount of withdrawals for all uses if the wells in this region continued in this type of response. This figure shows the freshwater withdrawal category comparisons for the 3 counties. The largest portion of freshwater withdrawn is for irrigated agriculture, and that's about 80% of the water withdrawn, as you can see on the left-hand side. So it's a very large percentage of the withdrawn freshwater. If we remove irrigated agriculture from this picture, just to clarify the other pieces of the pie, we'll find that the other 20% is clearer. Eddy County is the one county that has surface water reservoirs, and so it shows significant reservoir evaporation, whereas the other 2 counties have none. Public water supplies in the orange is the largest category of removal or withdrawal, and then that is followed by mining in the blue here. And I'll note that Eddy County has potash mining, so it has a more significant amount of removal for potash. Lee County, their withdrawals for mining include the withdrawals for oil and gas, and so that withdrawal there is mostly for oil and gas. And then Chavez has very little oil and gas or potash mining, so it's kind of our indicator county. And it has much less mining withdrawals than Lee and Eddy counties. And then the next largest withdrawer is for livestock watering. So agriculture, again, plays a role here. So what we wanted to do was to take a look at the farms, freshwater irrigation withdrawals with our farms, to see if we could pinpoint any trends that might be related to oil and gas. And that seems like a reach. However, we know from much anecdotal information there is a lot of sales of water from farming to oil and gas. And so we wanted to see if there was a link and if we could find that. We also wanted to see if there were trends in irrigation and farming that were significant as a result of the drought. All three counties were impacted similarly by reduced rainfall and runoff. We consider Chavez County to be our indicator, as I said, our control county, because it has less mining and less oil and gas activity than Lee and Eddy counties. And we saw a decrease in freshwater irrigation withdrawals, number of irrigated farms, and number of irrigated acres, all 3 for Chavez County. And so we figured this is our best indicator of agricultural-related water withdrawals, groundwater withdrawals. There also is very little surface water in the county, and so basically this is all groundwater in this case. All three counties lost irrigated farms and irrigated acres over time, although we did see an increase in acres from 2000 to 2007 to 2012, but it was a net decrease since 2002. Only Lee County showed any increase in irrigation withdrawals, but at the same time lost irrigated farms and irrigated acres. They experienced a large increase in agricultural groundwater withdrawals by about 33%, while in Eddy and Chavez there was a 17% and 28% decrease respectively. So then we asked, was the increase in irrigation in Lee County a result of the increase in irrigated acres? Without other data, we were forced to conclude that the withdrawals were most likely related to the effect of drought on agriculture, farm consolidation, and possibly groundwater depletion that have reduced the withdrawals in Chavez and Eddy counties. However, we know there's no way to determine if agricultural withdrawals are sold for oil and gas or other uses without going around asking every individual farmer, who's very unlikely to want to give us that information. But it is a distinct possibility in Lee County based on anecdote. Water withdrawn for irrigation can be sold. It's a very beneficial dollar quantity for farmers, and so we believe that it's happening, but we can't really quantify it. We believe that this irrigation withdrawal could have some impact, could be impacted by sales to oil and gas, but we really don't know, particularly in Lee County. But this is not what's shown in Eddy. If we look at the well starts in Eddy and Lee counties, we can see there was a upward trend in well starts in Eddy County, downward trend in Lee County. Although we know that there was quite a bit of activity in Lee County, but it probably did not relate to well starts, but just to well use. We calculated freshwater use per well based on data from Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department, and saw an expected trend that the water use followed the well starts for both counties. It went down for Lee, up for Eddy. Chavez saw very little change because they have very few well starts. As such, the freshwater withdrawals for Lee County oil and gas decreased over time. For Eddy County, they increased. About twice as many wells were fractured in Eddy County than in Lee County during this period of time, which is shown in our paper. I didn't include it here. But this is the only times during which we had specific data available. So we do know that we're using a little less water in Lee County and a little more in Eddy. This tends to support what we determined for the agriculture use, that perhaps there wasn't as much sales to oil and gas. Finally, we looked at the percentage of directional wells, unconventional wells, that were drilled in all of the New Mexico counties. We don't have specific information, I'm not showing it here for the specific counties. This data is only being recently collected. It's not always on the web, available on the web, and so it's difficult to parse it out. However, we believe it's mostly reflective of the drilling that occurred in the southeast corner of the state. A larger number of directional wells drilled correlates with increased water use generally, and that correlates well with the data for Eddy County, showing that more wells drilled and more wells fractured, along with more freshwater use per well for oil and gas. Regardless of the source of fresh water, if oil and gas use increases, this is going to impact other uses over time, we believe. So it's complicated. I won't get into a lot about treatment. I'm happy to talk about it with folks offline later, but it will take a lot of time. I just want to point out that we have potential sources of water, including mostly fresh water. Brackish water is occasionally used, and municipal wastewater for drilling and production. Within the drilling and production regime, we have opportunities for recycling. We produce frac flowback water and also produced water, which is formation water, and that can be recycled back into the system via use for water flooding, enhanced oil recovery, and hydraulic fracturing. So this is what we would like to see. And then eventually we have a sink for this water, and that includes disposal via deep well injection and sometimes evaporation. So that's where this water goes. So if you use fresh water in your drilling production, eventually it will be completely consumptively used. So policy, we wanted to reduce the use of fresh water in oil and gas operations, updated several rules in the state to encourage recycling. We allowed multi-well fluid pits. No permit was needed for recycling within the oil and gas industry, so they are free to reuse this water without having to notify us. There are timeframes used for specific pit uses, just so that people don't dig a pit and then leave it forever. So that's an important environmental requirement. And then we have liability and insurance rules in place, which is a very important part of making this work. We also updated other rules for produced water handling and surface waste management. Most importantly, there's a permit by rule provision that reduces the regulatory burden and reduces the number of individual permits. And so we have a recycling-friendly regulatory framework. So we think this is a good thing. However, we don't yet know what is going to happen in the future. Right now, we found that there are significant gaps between our reporting frameworks for fresh water and our potential non-traditional water resources like produced water. It's not transparent to identify who uses what water and where and when. Understanding the interconnection between agricultural withdrawals of fresh water and sales to industry would help greatly in determining developing market-friendly ways to conserve fresh groundwater during droughts. Basically, during a drought, farmers would prefer to sell this water to the industry and make extra money, whereas it might be better for them to keep it in the ground. And then finally, regulations or guidance that smooth the way to treat and use produced water outside of the oil and gas industry are needed. We are looking into that and doing some research on that now. I think it would be a very useful thing if we could economically treat produced water for other uses. Future data needs to be analyzed to determine if the regulations are affecting freshwater use. However, this is going to be complicated because we have a downturn in oil and gas development right now. So it'll be difficult to determine what is happening if in the near future at least. If you want to contact me, this is where I am, and that's all I have.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that presentation. I thought that was a really good overview of kind of how this is impacting, how this fracking is impacting water resources. And it just seems like wasn't that long ago, a year ago, fracking was just the talk of everybody. Now, with the change in the oil market, it's really gone down a bit, but it seems inevitable that it's going to come back, and that it's important for us to understand how fracking will impact water resources, and how it can also, what we can do to change the kind of rules, regulations, and practices to protect water resources, particularly in arid climates like New Mexico, like Texas, or even like North Dakota, and throughout the world.